Hello, Celia. Welcome to Game Hype. It's a
Hello.
pleasure. Hello, it's a pleasure having you here, and thanks for putting time into this. I think it's so late now in LA, right?
It's not too late. It's 8 p.m.
Okay.
In LA. It's early for you though.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It's 7. Yeah, it's almost 8 a.m. here, but it's great having you. So I'm going to introduce a bit you, but I like to ask you to introduce yourself more. Um, Celia is a game UX game consultant and has more than 10 years experience in UX design, working in game studios like Epic Games, Ubisoft, and now I think you're a freelance consultant
Mhm.
in UX, and
Yep.
your book is recently released, like le UX, quoi exactement?
Yeah.
C'est vrai?
Bravo. Oui. En français, oui. It's the translation of my latest book that came out in English last year in French.
Awesome. So it's all to you, and we'd like to hear your presentation.
Sweet. Well, thank you so much. I'm very happy to be with you. It's always complicated because of the time difference. But it's a pleasure to be here with you. And just very quick, for those who don't know me, so I have a PhD in psychology. I'm French, and I've been working in the game industry for a while. So I worked at Ubisoft in France and in Montreal, in Canada. I worked at LucasArts on Star Wars games in San Francisco, at Epic Games, where I was director of UX. And I worked on a lot of different games, including Fortnite. And yeah, I left Epic in 2017, and since then I'm an independent consultant. So I mostly do UX strategy. I'm not a designer myself. I do work a lot with UX designers, but I mostly do strategy to make sure that the game teams know exactly what sort of experience they want to offer, and who are the users, who are the core target, and make sure that they have what they need, that the right people are hired, that we have the right processes and stuff like that. So this is what we're going to talk about. I know some of you have already seen some of that presentation, so part of it is going to be very redundant, but the idea is to make sure that everybody's on the same page, and then we're going to have a focus on hyper casual games, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. So let's start. What's fun about UX is that it's becoming more known today, and it's more trendy. And it started like a few years ago. I remember I played that game Kung Fu Rabbit on my phone. It was when I was at LucasArts, so it was probably around 2012 or something like that. And it was a platforming game, and I died a lot trying to pass a level. And I unlocked this achievement. It's not Photoshop; it's a real achievement from that game. And it was really funny to me because this is really an expression of if the player that is supposed to love your game, who bought your game, or I don't remember if it was free to play back then, and is enjoying your game, but is dying again and again and again. The problem is not the user, it's not the player, it's probably a problem in the game. And that's a very strong UX mindset, is really thinking about the user first, the human is going to play the game first, and trying to detach ourselves from our perspective as a game developer. And so this is what UX is about. It's a mindset. It's about considering the human factors, considering that it's going to be human beings that are going to play your game. And so when you create your game or any object systems or services, making sure that you understand the limitations of that human. So we have physical limitations, but we also have mind limitations, cognitive limitations, and we need to understand that in order to offer the best experience possible. And also for games, the experience that we want to offer, because games are supposed to be challenging and fun and create some certain emotions. So we have, since it's an art form, we have another goal here. And just to be clear, UX is not just about the UI. UI, the interface is very important. Of course, it's going to impact the user experience, but it's not about just UI. And a different type of UI is not changing necessarily. This is not because like the Heinz tomato ketchup. It's not that the one on the right is thinking about UX and the one on the right is thinking about UI. Both are about the UI, but they're going to impact the experience differently. And we cannot talk about user experience without the user. So what matters is, at the end of the day, how people are going to use this product depending on its UI, but not just the UI. Is the ketchup good? Do they need ketchup, and why would they need ketchup, and where do they put ketchup? It's considering all of that. All of that is the user experience. So it's not just about the UI, it's about everything that the player is going to interact with, feel, perceive, understand. So sure, it's going to be the UI, but it's also going to be the narrative, is going to be the art, is going to be the sound effects, is going to be all the things that players perceive and interact with. But it's also going to be the whole ecosystem they interact with. How did they learn about the game, and how did they download it, and what was this process, and if they have a problem, what happens if they have to contact customer service, or what happens when they interact with community managers on the social media. All of that is part of the user experience. So it's very broad. We're going to focus on how players interact with the game itself. And we're going to start by cognitive science. So I'm sure some of you have seen that before, but cognitive science is extremely important because it's at the core of UX. It's really the foundations of UX. We need to understand the humans to be able to offer a better experience. And because an experience happens in people's minds, what you feel, what you perceive, all of that is happening in our minds. We need to understand the limitations of the brain. So we're going to start with this. This is a very simplified representation of what's going on in the brain as we process information or as we learn. It always starts with perception. So we have stimuli in the environment, and we have a lot of senses that are going to get what's going on around us, but also inside our body. And perception is making sense of these inputs. And then we're going to process that information. And if we learn about something new, or it's strengthening our memory, or we're processing something, it's actually changing physically something in our brain. We have synapses, which are connections between neurons. And these connections are always changing. So the more we age, the less flexible they are, but it's still changing all the time. And depending on what we do, who we are talking with, what games we play, what activities we do, what's going on in the world, like we're in a pandemic and we have to change drastically the way of living and interacting with others. We cannot do that unless we have a very plastic, malleable brain that can adjust to what's going on in the environment. So the brain is what we have. We have what we call brain plasticity, and it's extremely important to survive our environment. And so that's the reason why the brain changes all the time, depending on what we do. So between perception and the change in memory, there's a lot of stuff happening. There's a lot of factors going to influence the quality of the information processes. One of the factors we're going to focus on is attentional resources. We know that the more we pay attention to something, the better we're going to process that information, and therefore the better we're going to remember it. And so it's really important to understand how our attention works, but also emotion and motivation have an impact. I'm going to talk a little bit about that a bit later on, but for now, we're going to focus on attention. So this is, again, extremely simplified. The brain does not have compartments like these that are independent and only working on one thing. Everything is interacting with one another. It's way more complex than it's shown here. So remember that the brain is extremely complex and we still don't understand everything, but these are the basic elements of the mental processes. So for each of these mental process, perception, memory, and attention, I'm going to show you one of the main limitations that all human brains have, at least all neurotypical human brains have, so that we can understand how to make better experiences. So this is a first example. Take a look at this and think about what are you perceiving in this image. So depending on who you are, depending on what games you've played before, you are not going to perceive this image in the same way. If you've played Street Fighter 2 or you know that game very well, you're very likely to recognize those characters very quickly. I typically have my Street Fighter core fans like immediately say, oh, Street Fighter characters. But then other people are going to be like, I don't know, colors, flags, or could it be transistors or Lego blocks or Minecraft? So I get a lot of different answers. And if you're colorblind, which is the case of about 8% of the male population, you can feel excluded from this little game, and I apologize for that. But it's very, very important to remember that perception is subjective. It's going to depend on your prior knowledge of what you did in your life personally, on your culture, on your expectations, even on your DNA. Like I said, if you're colorblind, it's because of your DNA. And so perception is subjective. It's not, we do not perceive reality as it is. Perception is a construction of the brain. And that's a big problem for us as we are making games, because it's not because we're creating assets that to us seem obvious or intuitive that it's going to be intuitive for all your players. And that's why we need to test. So we test assets. We test all the visual assets and the sound effects, and we can test character design, environment design. We can also test menus. So here's an example with the UI, but it's not just about the UI. So in Fortnite, for example, back in 2013, we had a very strong prototype already. So we brought players over, they played Fortnite for a little bit, and then I showed them a survey with some elements and asked them, what is this? What is that? So I could see what they perceive and is it matching what we're trying to communicate. For this icon, I don't know if you guessed, this was the representation of traps in the crafting menu. But when I asked them, what is this? A few players actually did not recognize or understood that. They said stuff like, oh, it looks like ammunition or maybe trees or something related to building. So now we have an icon that was obvious to us, but is not obvious to our players. And in that case, we want to change the design. Instead of asking players to change, we don't change the humans, we change the design instead. So we changed it into an archetype of a trap, a bear trap. And after we did that, there were no more confusion, at least for Western players. We do have to be careful when we use archetypes and like these to verify that they are valid across territories. So if you ship a game internationally, you have to make sure that the symbols you're using is going to be meaningful to the different cultures, because many symbols are really related to a culture and not necessarily international. So we test and we test again to verify if it works or not. Now I would like you to, I don't know if you know this statue, because I'm French, I have a tendency to talk about this statue. It's pretty iconic. It's the thinker from Auguste Rodin, Le Penseur. So it's the guy who's naked and sitting down and thinking deeply about things. So it's pretty well known. But if you do know this sculpture, can you remember exactly his posture, more precisely on which leg or legs lay which arm or arms of the thinker? So think about it for a few seconds. The most common answers that I get is right arm on the left leg. Then people say no, it's the other way around. And some people say no, it's on the same side or the other side. But it's extremely rare that people give me the correct answer, which is he has both arms on the left leg. And the reason why it's hard, so you can do that little game with something that you're more familiar with. If you did not know the thinker, try to think about an artwork that you know very well. Can you really precisely bring up to your mind and then check how accurate you were? Because the problem is that memory is fallible. We don't remember things accurately. And I told you earlier that perception is we don't perceive reality as it is. Perception is a construction of the brain. Memory is a reconstruction. So when we have to remember something, it's not as if we're like finding a file where we have the pictures of things and we just bring that to consciousness. No, we rebuild our memory. And as we do that, we can introduce we can alter these memories. And sometimes we can even create false memories. So we should not rely too much on our memory. That's why it's very important to write down when you have a meeting, like make sure that you write down what happened and everybody agrees. And so that there's not going to be any memory issue, because you can just like read the email again. And this is what we'll also do in games. We try to reduce the memory load. We avoid players trying to remember too much. So this is from Fortnite. The HUD is all about making sure that players are not going to remember, not going to forget about what they have to do, what key they need to press to do things. And that's alleviating the memory load, because from one play session to the next, players might forget about stuff, and for what they do remember, it might not be accurate. So we should not rely on memory as when we work, but we should not also rely on players' memory. So we try to reduce memory load. Another game I want you to play here, I'm going to show you some cards. I would like you to pick one card and try to remember it as accurately as possible. So pick one and remember that card. I bet I can guess which card you picked and make it disappear. So if that worked for you and your card is not there anymore and you wonder what happened, magic. No, actually change all the cards. And if you did not notice that, it's because we don't have good attentional resources. So magicians are very good at, they know the limitations of the brain very well. And this is how they make their magic work. And you do also need to understand how the brain works to make the magic of the game work. But what happens here is when I ask you to pick one card, usually what we do is we're going to focus on just one and we're going to filter out the rest. This is typically the way attentional resources work. And so from one scene to the next, sometimes there's a big change and we don't notice it. This is a very well-known phenomenon. It's called change blindness in psychology. And it's very common. And it means that it's not because something appeared in the game or something has changed that players necessarily are going to notice it. And if they do notice it, they might not be able to really process it. But even if they did process it, they're not necessarily going to remember it. So attentional resources are scarce. We also need to be careful with that. So in games, what we try to do, in many games, we do challenge attentional resources, like action games, all about can you avoid things and try to follow different stuff. So we do oftentimes ask players to try to multitask. But what you want to make sure is that as you teach players the mechanics of the game, try to have one thing at a time. Do not start the game with everything at the same time. And make sure that you challenge attentional resources the way you want to. Again, when we know the game, we know what's going to happen. So it's easier for us to pay attention to the right things. The player does not necessarily know what they need to focus on. So it's going to be harder for them. The attentional load is going to be harder. So again, very simplified, but perception is subjective, attention resources are scarce, and memory is fallible. These are the constraints you also need to work with in order to make the best game possible. So now that we know that, how is this impacting our framework when we work on a game? I'm going to show you the framework that I've been using. It's breaking down game UX into two big pillars. The first one is usability, and the second one is what I call engageability. Usability is about making the game usable. Can players pick it up easily? Can they understand what's going on? Can they understand what is the objective of the game? What key they need to press, or what gesture they need to do on their phone to make it work? What's happening? All of that is about usability. Can the game be used efficiently? That's going to be extremely important for hyper casual games, because if the game is not usual, it's typically games that are free. We download them to try them out. If we don't understand it, or if it's frustrating immediately, people are gone. You don't have a lot of time to convince. And so if you have some frustrations or things are not clear, players are going to be gone. So you need to have a strong focus on usability for any free-to-play game, actually, but even more specifically for hyper-casual games. This list is a list of guidelines that are really important for usability in games. It's heavily inspired by the 10 usability heuristics by Jacob Nielsen. But these heuristics, a heuristic is the rule of thumb. So like we have a general idea of what we should or should not do. They were made for web design or for apps. In games, it's a bit different. We use a different vocabulary. So what I was trying to do here is to have a common language and broad guidelines about what is going to be important to make your game usable. I'm not going to go through all of this, but the signs and feedback and polishing your signs and feedback in the game is going to be crucial for any game, but even more so for a hyper casual game, because you do want people to understand what's going on. And players are not going to read a manual. They're not going to watch a video tutorial. They're just going to learn your game for hyper casual games only through their experimentation with it. So it means you need to rely on the signs and feedback in your game to teach your players how to play. Most of the time, you're going to give a few tutorials like swipe or do whatever, but for the rest, players are going to just understand it as they play. So it means you have to be extremely clear. Signs and feedback are all the elements that can inform the player what's going on in the game, what they can do with the game. And as they do something, they put an input in the games, they swipe or whatever. What is the feedback that is also informing them what's going on in the game? So I'm going to go through that fairly quickly because we don't have a lot of time. But here's an example from Brawl Stars. It's not a hyper casual game, but it's fairly mainstream. What's interesting, I don't know if you played Brawl Stars. If you have not, just by looking at it, can you tell where you can go, for example? So for level design is really important. For example, the signs here, there's a lot of different signs. So signs can be from the UI, can be from character design. In that case, we're looking at level design. So if you look at what's going on in the environment, you see, for example, here, the blue blocks, it's probably collision there. You probably cannot go through these blocks because they look solid. However, those ones here, it looks like bushes that are bluish. This ones, probably you can go through them and probably can hide inside because tall grass, in games, in many cases, we can hide inside the tall grass. The crates, they look solid, so you probably cannot go through them, but you probably can destroy them, unlike the blocks here. See, all of these are signs about what you can and cannot do in the environment. And if they're intuitive, if just looking at them, you can tell, and by you, I mean the player, not you as a developer, that means it's done well. And this is what you want. You want your signs and feedback. So feedback is, for example, here the player it's me in that case. It's pushing on the screen to shoot, and so you have a feedback. It's actually showing you. It's also a sign telling you where are you gonna aim. This sign is also telling me what type of weapon I have. It's probably something like a rifle, and so this is a feedback because there's an input from me. So if your signs and feedback are very well done, it means that your player don't really have to really learn about the game. It's going to be intuitive immediately. And that's going to be very, very, again, critical for hyper casual games. You also want them to be consistent. You want them to be here. You want them to be clear. Can players tell what's going on or what they need to do? Like, for example, you see gems on the floor. Probably you need to pick them up, and you pick them up and you see a feedback. The gem is flying over here. And then you have one more tick. growing the bar here. So you think, okay, probably if the bar is full, we win. So all of that is signs and feedback. Just by looking at what's going on in the experiment by yourself, you can figure out how you play your game. So they need to be here. They need to be clear. And by clear, I mean for your players. So we test with them and not just based on us, our gut feelings. And we feel, well, for us, it's intuitive. So it should be intuitive for everyone. No, because perception is subjective. So you need to test. And they need to be consistent. Like, for example, here you have different enemies. Every time you have a different enemy, you have a different type of weapon. And by consistent means that if it's similar, it should look similar. So what's similar here, they're all weapons. So as you're about to use them, you see the visual treatment. So when it's yellow here, it's because you had like an ultimate, or it's like a super shot here. But all weapons, you have like the same white treatment. But when things are different, they should also look and sound and feel differently. So for example, it's a different weapon here. This one is probably a rifle. This one is probably a shotgun, so shorter range. And this one is probably something you throw, then kind of going to have an area of effect. So probably a bomb or something. If your signs are different, it helps player understand that there's something different here. So for similar functionality, you need to have similar signs and feedback. But for different functionalities, they need to look and sound and feel different. A lot of work needs to happen on the signs and feedback. And if your signs and feedback are done correctly, then you have a good form follows function. What that means is like just by looking at it, looking at the form or listening to it, because sound design is also important, less for hyper casual, but it's still very critical. Can people understand the functionality of that thing? Here's an example with character design, with Mario, the enemies in Mario. Just by looking at them, you can anticipate how they can be dangerous to you or how they work. Like this one is attached to the ground. It's not going to run after you. And this one is going to go very fast in one direction. So if you're close by, you need to move away fairly quickly because it's going to go fast. Unlike the tortoise. A tortoise is a very strong mental model. A mental model is a representation that we have for the things in real life. In real life, tortoises are slow. So we can expect that this enemy is going to be slow. In real life, flowers don't have teeth, but in real life, also flowers do not walk. So that enemy is probably going to stay in the ground. But what's different from real life flowers is this one has teeth. So it's probably not a good idea to jump on it as the mouth is open. This one is probably going to be dangerous for you from far away because it's about to throw a bone. So you have to be careful even if you're not close to it, unlike the boulder here that is attached to the ground or the flower. And Bowser, probably not a good idea to jump on it because of the spikes. That sort of affordance is another term, it's a similar concept than form follows function. It's going to be, again, very, very important for hyper casual games because it's going to tell players what they can and cannot do and how, to play that game. And you need to test them because, again, usually if you use a mental model that's very strong, that's from nature, like tortoises are slow, something like that, you can anticipate that, okay, players are going to understand this is going slow. But sometimes we use symbols that mean something to us in our culture, but not necessarily in other cultures. So we have to be careful. We still have to test and verify that, yes, it's going to be intuitive also for players. Here's an example here on Helix Jump. Helix Jump, it's using a ball. What do balls do usually? They bounce and they fall. If you throw a ball, it's going to fall down. So you see that the ball's on the platform, it's probably going to go down. And if it touches the platform, it's probably going to bounce. So that's using a strong mental model of how balls work in real life to make players understand how this game works. And so you just need to tell them, how to swipe, to move to rotate the thing, the helix, and you're done. And so if you have a strong mental model, if you find a very good metaphor of how you game, you think about what sort of gameplay you want, is it going to be a runner? Is it going to be going up and down? What is it play is going to have to do? What is the gameplay here? And then you have to find the the best metaphor to express that as clearly as possible for a hyper casual game. So that's a good affordance, a good form follows function. So that's for usability. Again, we can talk a lot about these things, but we don't have a lot of time. So I'm going to move on a little bit. But that's going to be very important. Like, you cannot have frictions that are not by design. Of course, there's going to be friction. Players are going to fail and going to win sometimes and going to lose sometimes. They're going to die, have to restart. So yes, there's going to be friction, but all these friction are by design. You do not want frictions that are not by design. You don't want players to be confused about what gestures you need to do on their phone. You don't want them to be confused about it's going to go up, down, sideways. All these things need to be as clear as possible from the get-go, because again, you do not have a lot of time to convince. You have a few seconds, like at most like a couple minutes with a hyper casual game to really convince your players. So that's for usability. But even if your game is usable, it's not necessarily going to be fun. So we also need to ensure that the game is going to be fun. But what does that mean? What is the theory behind what's fun or not? For usability, we have decades of research, both from academia and practitioners, that can make us understand what makes something usable. We don't have as much research for what makes something fun. You have a lot of a few theories. You have a few framework. I mean, there are frameworks existing, but it's still it's not as strong as usability. So some people talk about fun. For example, Ralph Koster talks about the theory of fun. I prefer to stay away from that term because people. Most of the time we have a very strong feeling of what we find fun. And so then it's going to be very personal. Like maybe you don't find chess fun, for example, or you don't find playing ball fun. And so if we use a term that is strongly emotional for people, then we fail to have a common language. And here, this is what I'm trying to do. So I moved away from that term. Now I'm using the term engageability, which is a made-up term. This is my way of putting these things together. So you can use another term if you prefer. But here, what we care about is, are people engaged with the game? Do they want to play the game? And after they played it, do they want to play it again? If they do, if they come back, and if you have good retention, it means they're engaged. And if they're engaged, it means probably that they're having fun with your game, whatever fun means to them. So that's the reason why I use that term engagement. Now, what do we put in there? Again, I mean, it's not as strong as usability. This is my way of breaking it down for games. And I have a strong focus on motivation, because if there's no motivation to do something, you're not doing that thing. If you have no motivation to play that game or to play again, you're not going to play it. So there is no behavior without motivation. So understanding motivation is going to be really, really key. Then emotion is going to be important, like how emotional it is. Is it what sort of game feel you have in your game? I'm going to talk about what that means. That's also going to be very important for hyper casual games. And I'm going to talk a little bit about game flow and mostly about learning curve and onboarding. So let's start with motivation. We need to motivate players, and we need to understand what is going to be motivating for them. The problem is that we have a lot of theories of human motivation, and currently we do not have one theory that can explain all of our behaviors as humans. So it's a bit messy. So here I'm going to focus on two main types of motivation. There are more than that, and there are a lot of theories, but these are really relevant for games. It's extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation. So extrinsic motivation is when you do something in order to gain something else that is external to the task. So for example, if you're doing a job and you don't really care about that job, but you just care about the money so that you can pay for things, that's an extrinsic motivation of doing the job. And in games, we do have extrinsic motivation. It's anytime you have to do a mission and you don't necessarily care about the mission, but you care about the reward for the mission. So in RPGs, you have sometimes stuff like that. You can have quests, and you don't necessarily want to do that quest, or you're like, oh, it's going to take me long, but I really do want the copper ore, or I really want that reward. I want that skin. So we do it because of the reward. So for extrinsic motivation to work, you need to have very clear goals and rewards. And for hyper casual games, clear goals is going to be extremely important, because players do need to understand how they can win the game, or how they can get better. We're going to get to that concept of progression a little bit later. But you need to have extremely clear goals, and you also need to have meaningful rewards associated to these goals. Is it points? And when you have points, what is it you get? All these things are going to be really important for extrinsic motivation to work. Otherwise, yeah, maybe there are goals and maybe there are rewards, but if you don't really understand, or if you don't really care about those rewards, you don't necessarily know what you're going to do with it. You don't necessarily want to play again and again to keep going and to level up and to unlock stuff. So even if the game feel, we're going to talk about that a bit later, is good and it's just fun to play, it can be very important to focus on what sort of goals you can reach and what rewards associated with that, and how the player is going to progress. So there's an extrinsic motivation to keep going and to see, how far we can go, or how I can look more cool, or have superpowers, or unlock something that's going to be super fun. So that's for extrinsic motivation. But you also care about what we call intrinsic motivation. These are the things we do just for the pleasure of doing them, like playing a game. So humans and a few other animals do that. They do activities just for the pleasure of doing them. We do have a good theory to try to explain this. It's called self-determination theory, or SDT for short. And it explains that we are more motivated intrinsically to do certain activities when these activities satisfy our needs for competence, autonomy, and relatedness. Competence is mostly about having a sense of progression. So I talked about that a bit earlier, because it's very related to also extrinsic motivation and rewards. So at work, or if, let's say, you want to learn a new language or play a new music instrument, let's say you put some effort into that, and you every day you play a little bit. If you see that you're progressing, if you feel yourself progressing, then you're going to feel competent. By competent, I don't mean that you're never going to fail, you're never going to make mistakes, or in a game, you're never going to die. It's not what I mean by competence. I mean that the more you put effort into it, the better you're at it. And so whether it's at your job, with any activity that you're doing, like sports or artwork or whatever, as you are practicing, you're getting better, then you feel competent. But if you practice and you feel that you're not getting better, even if maybe in reality you are, but you don't feel that you're getting better, that can really go against your motivation to keep going. And that can be extremely frustrating, and we stop. So for games, we do need to have that sense of progression. It's going to be very important. So sure, players are going to fail, there's going to be setbacks, but they do need to feel that they're progressing nonetheless. That's some of the reason why progression bars are so compelling. It's not just because you know that you're going to have a reward. So it's not just for the extrinsic motivation to feel the bar and get a reward. It's also because it's just so great feedback on your competence. You are progressing. Leveling up is telling you progressed. And so for games, it's going to be really, really important to express that to players. If players die, but then next time they try it again and they went farther, or they have a better score, then they're going to feel competent. They're going to feel they're progressing. Autonomy is about self-expression. So you see that a lot in games as well, is about choosing your skins, choosing your avatar, choosing your dance moves, like making it your own. But it's also about making choices that are meaningful. So games that are really strong in autonomy are more like systemic games like Minecraft, for example, or GTA, because you Grand Theft Auto, because you can do a lot of things in different ways. There's no one way of doing a thing. You have a lot of autonomy to accomplish your goal. And then relatedness is being able to play with others, so that we are a very social species. We need each other to survive. And so we love activities when we are working with someone. Sometimes we love competition as well, but cooperation is much stronger than competition. Most competitive games or sports are team-based. It's a team against another team. So competence, autonomy, relatedness is going to be really important. Now, you don't need to have all of that to have a good game. Competence is going to be really the most important ones, especially for hyper casual games. If you have more of that, that's great, but you don't have to fake it, or you don't have to add things just because you want to take all the things in there. If it's not going to be meaningful for your gameplay, do not add it. But a lot of games, like RPGs, for example, role-playing games, they are really crossing all the ticks, because you choose your role, so you have autonomy. You can show that you're competent, because everyone need each other to do that. So if you're competent, you have good signs of feedback, you can show off that, yeah, you saved the day for the group, or everyone is participating, and you have relatedness because you cooperate with your group. But for hyper casual games, again, like competence is going to be very key. You do want to show how a player is progressing. And it's really funny because a lot of games, hyper casual games, are about how far can you go, how more you can, how bigger can you get, how big can you get, or what is the best score you can get. And that's all about progression. Can you get better next time? Can you get bigger? Can you get farther? And so that's a clear, direct expression of competence. And so in your games, you need to express that. You need to make sure that players feel that they're progressing. Celebrating leveling up and showing, oh, this is where you are before you get to the chest. This is all about progression. Sure, there's extrinsic motivation also here. There's going to be a reward. But it's also about, oh, I'm progressing toward that goal. It's about the leaderboard. How far did you go? And are you getting better? Is it that next time you're going to go upper in the leaderboard? And it's all be, again, how far can you go before you get hurt? So it's going to be very important for you to express that clearly to players. So that's for motivation. Again, clear goals, clear rewards, and focus on competence. Make sure you express that players, how can they progress, and as they're progressing, you give that feedback to them. Now let's talk a little bit about emotion. So emotion in games when we talk about emotion in games, there are mainly two things that we're focusing on. First one is game feel, and second one is offering some novelties. For hyper casual games, game feel is going to be important. Game feel is how good it feels to interact with the game. So it's more like the toy aspect of the game. And so it's all about the interaction. What do you do? Like swipe and tap, and you have like all these games that you have to do a specific gesture and tap, 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 tap because you're fighting, or you do a swipe because you're cutting fruit. That's about game feel. It's about, is it fun to just interact with the system? So for that, we put a lot of focus on what we call the 3 C's. So the 3 C's stand for camera. What sort of camera is it? It's going to be isometric. It's going to be a side scroller. What sort of camera do you have? Character. What is the main character, and what are the other characters? What do they express? What is it making players feel? And controls. What sort of controls you do? You swipe and you tap. All that is going to have a different feeling when you interact with the game. Then we also need to focus on the sense of presence. The sense of presence is, do you feel that you are in the game, or do you feel you're just interacting with your phone? You want players to feel that they are in the game, and you have a sense of presence, like physical presence. They are the character that they're moving. They are the ball is bouncing, and the narrative presence. So you understand what's going on in the game, and what you're doing has an impact on the narrative design. So on the world, and like what happens when you interact with that world. So presence is going to be important. And last but not least is physical reality. So it's not about photorealism. It's about, is it believable? So for example, you pop balloons. Is it doing a nice pop? Do you hear like a sound effect if players turn it on? Does it feel like a balloon is popping? You have bricks, you break them. How do they break, and what sort of effects do you put when you break them? There's a lot of games it's just fun to just destroy stuff and break things just because it feels good just to interact with it, or to bounce a ball, or to tickle a character. Like that sort of thing is all about game feel and physical reality. Then novelty, it's going to be so for hyper casual games, you have a lot of hyper casual games. Typically the games that are working well is the games are, the mechanic is a bit similar, but there's a sense of novelty. There's something a bit new that draws attention. So the brain loves something that's when it's a bit new, not entirely new, because then we're like, oh, how does that work? But if we have some frame of reference, but then there's something a bit new, that's really typically raising our engagement with it. So that can be also important. But here's more specific examples for game feel. Like for example, the tap, tap, tap to fight. When the moment you fight with someone, like the tapping feels more like fighting rather than, swiping or doing a more gentle gesture. So that's going to reinforce the fact that you're fighting another character, and that's going to feel good because, like physically you want to destroy it. So that's game feel. The particle effects, like the balloons, and this is what you did, and you have the all the explosion of joy. That's also game feel. Or the coins that are like collecting coins. It's like woo, flying array, and you have all of that. That feels good, and we want that in a hyper casual game. That's going to be really important. So don't hesitate to exaggerate sort of things. It's typical from hyper casual games and arcade games actually. And Fruit Ninja, we mentioned that this is this slashing gesture. So we do a swipe, and in Fruit Ninja, this is what you do. This is how you destroy the fruit, is just by doing as if you were just slicing them up. That's about game feel. So there's the gesture, so that's the control, but there's also the juiciness, like 3 fruit combo plus 3, and you see all the particle effect, all that feels good. You really want to interact with it. Like you're just slicing fruit, but it feels good. Last thing I want to talk about is game flow. So game flow, you are in the flow of the game when you forget about everything else. You forget you're on the bus maybe, and you forget to get off the bus, or you forget that you're hungry, or you're really zoning out. And typically we have that when we are focusing on something we care about, when we're working on something that we care about, or when we're playing music or doing some artistic activity, or playing games that are really engaging. So this is something we do want to accomplish because it feels good to be in the flow. So there are 3 main components to game flow. The first one is difficulty curve. It's the level of challenge. Typically, you want a good level of challenge, not too easy, but not too hard. If it's too easy, it's boring. You're not really going to be in the flow. If it's too hard, it's going to be too stressful. So it's hard to find the right level of challenge, because it's also going to be challenge. The feeling of how challenging it is also very subjective. So it's going to depend on people. It's going to depend on people's moods, abilities, and what's going on in their life. But you do want to make sure that people are challenged, but not too much. So easier said than done, but this is what we're trying to get. It's also about the pacing, the rhythm of stress and pressure. There are moments where you tap, 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 tap. In moments you concentrate, the moment you wait, the moments like you have to be precise. It's you are getting more into the game flow when there's you alternate. It's not all the way like super intense or all the way super peaceful, because otherwise you don't have a good sense of pacing. And last but not least, it's all about the learning curve. You're not going to get into the flow if you don't understand how the game works. So it's going to be very important to onboard players properly so that they can understand how to play the game. So let's talk about this. How do you teach players how to play the game. There are three main learning principles that we're going to talk about here. The first one is behavioral psychology principles, and this is actually the one that we're going to focus on today. It's like basically behaviorism. So it's the rat. It's presses a lever and gets food. We learn a lot through experimenting with the environment and finding out that some things that we do lead to a reward and some things that we do lead to a punishment. So that's behavioral psychology. Then you have cognitive psychology principles. It's basically understanding that the brain is limited, that perception is subjective, attention resources are scarce, and memory is fallible. And we take that into account to build a good learning environment. So we talked about that already, so I'm not going to talk about it again. But for example, make sure that not too many things happen at the same time at the beginning of the game. That's an example of taking into account cognitive psychology principles, or testing that players perceive the features the way you intended. And the last one is constructivist psychology principles. That's also very important. But the idea is to you learn better as if you learn by doing, and what you do is meaningful to you. Now, for more complex games, we spend a lot of time on this, and it can be difficult. For hyper casual games, it can be as simple as, do you understand what's going on, and is it meaningful to you? Is the metaphor clear enough? Like you're in a farm, or you're protecting people, or you're in a race course, or whatever. But let's focus on behavioral psychology, conditioning, because that's very relevant to hyper-casual games. It's relevant to any game, but even more so for hyper-casual games. So conditioning is when we associate two events happening together. And you have two types of conditioning. The first one is classical conditioning. Pavlov's dog. You've heard of it. It's like the Pavlov was testing dogs. It was ringing a bell and then giving food to the dog. And he was repeating that several times a day. Ringing a bell, presenting food. Ringing a bell, presenting food. At some point, the dog's brain is associating the fact that when the bell is rang, there's going to be food. And so as soon as the bell is rang, the dog starts to what's the term? Sorry. Salivate. There you go. And so the dog was conditioned to salivate as the bell is rang, because typically you don't salivate just by hearing a sound. So it could be you if your microwave is just beeping, like, oh yes, my dinner is ready. So you start to salivate because you hear that ding. So that's classical conditioning. It's when two events happen close to each other repeatedly, you implicitly learn to link them. It's called that associative learning. So for example, in games, if you played that game, maybe you've trying to recognize this sound. So that's a sound from a Metal Gear Solid. And players, if you play Metal Gear Solid, you're likely being conditioned to react to that sound, because it's a sound that is played when enemies are about to spot you. And so you need to react quickly. Like you can either hide very quickly or get into the open and kill everyone. So you're conditioned to react to that sound. So classical conditioning is going to be important because players are going to realize, what's going on. If there's a flash, they're going to associate it with something. So you need, again, by polishing the signs and feedback, you can help players understand what's going to happen. But the other one that I really want to focus on is the operant conditioning. It's still the same principle. What is the main difference here is that the subject is active. Like in the first one, it's passive. Passively, if you hear tires screeching, you might expect a boom right afterwards because we typically associate that with a car crash. You're passive in there. Here, it's the Skinner box. So the rat, same thing, is going to salivate if there's a light turning on, because the rat learned that when the light is on or the bell is rang, it presses the lever, then it's going to get food. So here the rat has to do something. There's still a stimulus. There's a bell that is rang or a light that's turning on, but the rat needs to do something in order to get the reward or to avoid a punishment. And so in games, we have that a lot. You have a specific stimulus, you have to do something. There's a bomb, you have to escape. Or here, like in the Fruit Ninja, there's some things you need to slash and some others you need to avoid. That's operant conditioning. And you're about to do it. And you're like, oh no, it's a bomb. You don't do it. And so like go, no go, that sort of things. It's all of that is conditioning. Or you see a parkour and you see like red is not good, and just try to avoid only using colors to express information for players who are colorblind. So use colors, but not just colors. But all the things like that, and go left, go right, like all of that is operant conditioning. And so for this to work, again, you need to have clear sense and feedback. And sometimes we'll play around with that. Like here, it's easy to differentiate between a bomb and a lemon. But sometimes you have a fruit that's kind of the same size, same shape, and kind of same color. Then it's harder. And this is when you can play around with that. But typically you do want things to be clear. But sometimes you use that confusion to make it fun. So again, we learn a lot through conditioning. So when you raise your hand to talk, or learning your multiplication table, typically we'll learn that by heart. So that's conditioning, like 3 times 6, 18. So we have, these routines that we do. Or you see a light to fasten your seatbelt, or you hear the beep from your car. All of that is conditioning. So polish your signs and feedback again in your game, because if they are polished, your player is going to be able to learn through conditioning, and you're also going to be able to make that fun, because sometimes you're going to inverse the things. Like sometimes you need to go right, and sometimes you need to go left, and sometimes it looks like a bomb, but it's not a bomb. Oh, this one looks like something good, but actually it's a bomb. So that's what makes things fun for players. So again, all these principles and guidelines that we use for any game are going to be super useful for hyper-casual games, but there are no one recipe for making good games. What's important is understanding the ingredients, and depending on the type of game you're making, you're going to focus on several, more certain things more than others. And this is what we did here. We had a strong focus on sign and feedback. Again, that's going to be very important for any game. But for hyper-casual game, if it's not polished, it's likely not going to work. So we talked about very clear goals. We talked a lot about autonomy. We had a stronger focus on autonomy, on game feel, and on the learning curve and difficulty curve. We didn't really talk about that, but that's also going to be important. So to conclude, the main UX challenges in hyper-casual games is mostly polish your usability. A hyper-casual game is not going to work if players don't understand what's going on. So make sure it's usable. It needs to be very easy to pick up immediately and understand. Also focus on your onboarding. Make sure that players can understand what's going on, and rely on clear sense and feedback so players can learn easily just by playing through conditioning. Use strong mental models, something that are clear, like balls are bouncing and falling down. That's a clear mental model, and players immediately going to understand how to play that game. You'll need to have to pay attention to game feel and physics, because those games need to feel good playing. And so polish, what sort of controls do you want, like slashing, swiping, and tapping? That's going to have an impact on how good it feels. Polish the particle effects and what's happening in the game, because sometimes it's just you want just to play the game because it just feels good to play it, even though you actually do not care about going farther, whatever, just because you want to kill a bit of time and it feels good to do this gesture or just to see particle effects. And focus on competence. Make sure that players can see their progression and understand where they're going, and that they feel they're going again farther and going bigger and whatever. That you need to have a clear feedback on competence for players. So giving them a sense of progression. All right. And so again, UX is a concern of everyone on the team. It's a mindset. So all of you should focus on offering the best experience possible. It's the concern of programmers, of artists, of designers, of producers. All of the team needs to understand all that to put the priorities where they need to be. Think about your design thinking mindset. Again, You prototype, you test it out with real players to see how it works. Do they understand? I know that for hyper casual games, you don't have the time or the budget to do a lot of user tests, but do pick a few players to make sure that the signs are, again, signs and feedback are clear, and people understand what to do before you implement things. And typically, the studios making hyper casual games, they make a ton of them before like maybe one or two is really a hit, because you need to prototype and see what's going to really feel good. And sometimes just one parameter is going to change the whole game. So be in that prototyping mode all the time. Don't hesitate to try things, throw them away, start again, change parameters to see when it's going to work out. You don't want to really think deeply about the game and focus on how it feels like in your head. You need to really try stuff, prototype, try again. This is how this is going to work. So that's it. So remember that the brain is very good at making sense of the world with very little information. This is how we survived our predators, but this is also how we fall into biases. And so your players are biased, you are biased, and it's only through a UX process that you can go faster and be more efficient to accomplish your goal. So thank you, merci for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Celia. It was a great presentation. I really enjoyed. So I'm going to ask one question, and then we can put the rest for Q&A session if you agree. Okay. So I had this question in mind that what's the psychology behind this mainstream games like hyper casual, that they are this much popular? Is it this being fun for? Is there a is it something related to being fun for a big group of people, or being very simple, or because you also mentioned Brawl Stars, and it's
it's not hyper casual, but it has good signs and feedback.
Not hyper casual, but having like being mainstream and having a lot of
very popular.
So can you walk us through this being so popular idea?
Yeah, so it's actually hard to understand why one game is going to be super popular and not the other. So some of it we can explain through the UX guidelines that I gave you. So some of them is just because the game feel is so good. It just feels good. Like I remember, like some games is just about, like, again, slashing fruit. It just feels good to do that. And even if you're not like into like progressing and you don't necessarily want to unlock something crazy, you just want to relax, and just slashing fruit can be really relaxing. So it really depends on the sort of game you're playing, depends on the player, it depends on the context. Why do you want to play that sort of game? Sometimes we want to play complex games, sometimes we're down for playing chess because it's going to be challenging, and we know it's going to be a different set of skills than when we slash fruit or when we punch giants. So it depends on many things. And that's why I found it more useful to focus on the ingredients rather than thinking there's one recipe. But of course, there's not just UX principles, there's also luck. So sometimes there's a game that picks up for whatever reason because it's the right moment and it's the right level of novelty from games that appeared before. So there's there's some luck in there. There's just context. But then, to me, what's important is to have a UX strategy, because luck and context, you cannot control that. But you can control the process.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, there is no fixed recipe for that. So we need to go through the details you mentioned and then test it and have prototypes and then see.
Yeah. Look at what happens. You have a game that makes super hit, and then you have a lot of games that just copy it. And sometimes some of them pick up as well, but then at some point, it's going to be something else, and those games, fall down. So do not focus necessarily on what is the current trend and what people like now. yeah, sometimes you can just by changing one parameter make it really cool and a bit different enough that people really want to play that game. So you can try this methodology, but again, typically what people do is they think about many ideas and immediately they prototype and they try it out with people and say, okay, well, put them in the hands of people and see how they react, and try not to be on their face as they try it out, especially if they're friends and family, because otherwise they're not going to give you a really true feedback. Try to see how they react, and that's going to help you polish the game, tweak it. And again, sometimes you're trying to get there and it's not working, and then it's not still not working, and you change it a little bit and change it a little bit, and then at some point you have the perfect parameters, and then it works, and then the magic works. But we can't anticipate how what are these magic parameters. Yeah. So it's by you have your ingredients, so you change your parameters and you iterate. If you do that, you're more likely to find successful recipe. So more likely, there's no guarantee.
Yeah, got it. So we have the ingredients, but we need to iterate it to find the recipe.
It's about the ingredient, and then go into the kitchen and try stuff out and see, how people like it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So see you in Q&A.
Yeah, sounds great. Take care.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.